the morning of the 27th of March, 1995. At about 8:30, Maurizio Gucci arrived at Via Palestro 20 in Milan, the building that housed his private office. The city was still waking. The doorman, a man named Giuseppe Onorato, was sweeping the entrance steps the way he did most mornings, and Maurizio greeted him, the kind of ordinary greeting exchanged 1,000 mornings before this one. A gunman had followed him inside. Then came 4 shots. They were not hurried, the story goes, and they were not many. 4 is not many when you say it slowly enough. Maurizio fell on the steps he had climbed most mornings of his working life. The gunman turned then on the doorman and shot him too before walking away, unhurried, into the Milan morning. Giuseppe Onorato was gravely wounded. He survived. And that is the strange fact worth sitting with before the story goes any further. By that morning, no one who carried the name Gucci owned any part of the company that wore it on every buckle, every canvas bag, every silk scarf sold from Tokyo to New York. The name on the door of that private office, and the name of the man who had just fallen in front of it, were among the only places left, in the whole wide business, where that name still meant anything at all. It had taken almost 100 years to build that name into something the world would recognize on sight. It took far less time to take it away from the family that made it. The man's name was Maurizio Gucci, and tonight the story of the house that bore his name, told slowly and quietly for as long as you can stay awake. But before we go any further, shut your eyes, breathe deeply, let your shoulders sink into the bed. If these quiet histories help you rest, consider subscribing, but only if it genuinely helps you rest. And before you drift off, leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is there. I'll be sure to see everyone, come morning. It's good to know who's out there, in the dark, listening along. And one small promise before we set off. Any adverts will only ever come before the story begins. We never interrupt the story. It's how we keep the fire lit. Tonight we travel through 100 years of one family, one city, and the most beautiful luggage in the world. You don't need to follow every detail. You don't need to remember anything at all. Let it drift past you, the way a fine leather does after enough years of handling. Soft at the edges, worn smooth, still holding its shape. We begin long before Milan. Long before the name meant anything at all. We begin in London, in a grand hotel beside the River Thames, where an Italian boy carried other people's luggage and dreamed quietly of one day carrying his own. Every story needs a place to start, and this one starts in Florence. In the spring of 1881, in a house not far from the river, where a boy was born and given the name Guccio. Florence in those years was not yet the idea of itself that tourists would later carry home in postcards. It was a working city, built along the slow bend of the Arno, its narrow streets given over almost entirely to craft. Leather workers gathered in one quarter, goldsmiths in another, the straw platters and the hat finishers a little further on, each trade keeping mostly to its own street, the way trades in Florence had for centuries. A boy born into that world grew up inside a very particular understanding of what work meant, that a family's standing was worth only as much as the last thing it had made well, and no more. It was into that world, and that quiet expectation, that Guccio Gucci arrived on the 26th of March, in the year already given. His father was a man named Gabriello Gucci, and Gabriello, the story goes, was in the straw hat trade, a trade that had once meant something in Florence, when the wide-brimmed hats woven from Tuscan straw were shipped out across Europe by the thousand, worn by gentlemen and ladies who never gave a moment's thought to where the plaiting had been done, or by whose hands. It was delicate work, and skilled work, and for a long while it had kept a family fed. But trades fade the way rivers change course, slowly and then all at once. By the years when Guccio was growing into a young man, the straw hat business that had supported the Gucci household was failing. Fashions had moved on, cheaper hats came in from elsewhere. Whatever Gabriello Gucci had built, over however many years he had built it, was coming apart in his hands, and there was very little a father or a son could do to stop it. Guccio's daughter would say, much later in her life, something that has stayed attached to the family ever since, that the Guccis had never truly been saddle makers, whatever the shop windows would come to suggest. It is worth holding on to that thought now, at the very beginning, because it tells you something true about where this house came from. It did not come from an old and settled craft, handed down neatly from father to son. It came from a family whose trade was slipping away under them, and from a boy who had to go looking for a different one. So, somewhere in the final years of the 1890s, the exact year is not agreed upon, though it was likely 1897 or thereabouts, a teenage Guccio Gucci left Florence. He did not go far at first, the story goes. Paris for a season perhaps before the crossing to England, but he went in the end all the way to London, a city that must have seemed to a Florentine boy like another world entirely. Grey instead of gold, cold instead of warm, and enormous in a way that Florence, for all its beauty, had never been. He arrived with very little, and he needed work, and the work he found was at a hotel that had opened only a few years before, on the north bank of the River Thames, called the Savoy. You have to understand what the Savoy was in those years to understand what it gave him. It was not simply a grand hotel, it was by most accounts the grandest hotel in the whole of Europe. The first in London lit entirely by electric light, the first to install electric lifts to carry its guests between floors, the first with private bathrooms fitted to nearly every room, at a time when such a thing was still a marvel worth mentioning in the newspapers. Royalty stayed there, composers stayed there. The wealthiest families of half a dozen countries passed through its doors every season, trailing porters and maids and mountains of luggage behind them. The hotel itself was still young when Guccio arrived, barely a decade built. It had been raised by an impresario named Richard d'Oyly-Carte, and paid for, curiously enough, with the profits of comic opera. The takings from a wildly popular production had gone directly into its foundations. Carte wanted something the like of which London had never seen, and the architect he hired gave it to him. A vast confident building on the north bank of the river, with lifts that rose on cables rather than ropes, each one fitted with an emergency brake, so that even the machinery of arrival felt, to the guests who used it, entirely safe. Guccio, of course, had no upper room money behind him, and no architect drawing up his future. He had only his eyes and what they were slowly learning to see. And somewhere among the staff of that hotel, a porter by most tellings, and for a time a boy who worked the new electric lift, was Guccio Gucci. Picture it, if it helps you drift. The lift itself, a small cage of brass and glass, rising slowly through the middle of the building. It is not fast, this lift. Nothing in this part of the story is fast. It climbs a floor at a time, at the pace of the age it was built in, and inside it, morning after morning, evening after evening, stands a Florentine boy in a porter's jacket, doing a job that asks almost nothing of him except that he stand still and watch and carry. And what he carried, hour after hour, was luggage. Steamer trunks bound in leather and brass, deep enough to hold a season's worth of clothing. Hat boxes, dressing cases fitted, inside, with little silver bottles and ivory-handled brushes, each one sitting in its own velvet-lined hollow, cut to its exact shape. Fitted cases for jewellery, cases built only to carry a single pair of boots, and built beautifully, as though the boots inside mattered as much as anything else a person owned. He watched the guests as closely as he watched their luggage, the story goes, and he began to understand something that no one at the Savoy ever sat him down and taught him directly. In that world, a person's luggage arrived at the hotel a full moment before the person themselves stepped out of the carriage. The porters saw the trunks first and took the guest's measure from them, the way you might take the measure of a letter before you have met the one who wrote it. Fine leather, brass corners kept bright, a maker's stamp discreetly placed. All of it said, quietly and without a single word being exchanged, "Here is a person of standing." Cheap luggage, however well meant, said the opposite just as quietly. Hotels like the Savoy ran on a strict order, invisible to the guests upstairs and absolute to everyone below them. A porter stood some distance from the top of that order, well above a scullery boy, well below a head waiter or a long-serving hall porter, and he was paid to match, enough to get by on, modestly, in a shared room not far from the hotel, and not a great deal more. The work was steady, and it was respectable, and for most young men who did it, it was also, quietly, as far as they ever expected to go. Guccio, the story goes, did not see it quite that way. He watched the same guests arrive with steamer trunks, and return months later with new ones. Replaced not because the old cases had worn through, but because fashion itself had moved on, the way it always does among people who can afford to let it move. Somewhere in that repetition, an ambition began to take a shape that most porters never let themselves imagine. Somewhere in the coming and going of those lifts, watching that luggage pass in front of him thousands of times over, a boy who had come to London with almost nothing began to form an idea. Not yet a plan, an idea. That the trunks themselves, and not merely the people who owned them, were worth his full attention. There is a further chapter to his London years that the family told for generations, though it is harder to pin down with certainty, and so it is worth offering gently rather than firmly, that after his time at the Savoy, Guccio spent a further stretch of years with the Compagnie des Wagons Lits, the company that ran the great sleeping cars and luxury carriages, crossing Europe by rail. If it is true, it would only have deepened the same education, more fine luggage, more travelling aristocracy, more of that same quiet lesson repeated in a different setting, on wheels instead of lift cables. If it happened as the family remembered it, picture the difference. No longer a lift climbing 5 or 6 floors within one building, but whole trains, panelled in dark wood and lit by their own lamps, carrying the same kind of traveller clear across a continent, Paris toward Vienna, Vienna on toward Constantinople, in carriages fitted out like small moving hotels. The luggage on those trains was, if anything, grander still. Cases built to survive days on end of jolting track, and still arrived looking as though they had never left a dressing room. A young man who had already spent years learning to take the measure of fine leather at the Savoy would have found, on the railways, only more of the same lesson, delivered at greater length and at greater speed. Whether the years add up precisely as the family remembered them, we cannot say for certain. What can be said with more confidence is that by the time this young man turned back toward Italy, he had spent several formative years among the very finest luggage that Europe made, without ever once being able to afford a piece of it himself. He returned to Florence in the early years of the new century, around 1902, most accounts agree, no longer a boy and no longer quite the same young man who had left. And soon after his return, he married. Her name was Aida Calvelli, the daughter of a tailor, herself skilled with a needle, and together, over the years that followed, they built a large household. A stepson first, then a daughter, then sons, one after another, the family growing the way families grew in those years, before anyone thought to plan such things. A household needs an income, and Guccio needed a trade to match the idea he had brought home with him. So he did what a serious man does with an idea and no money. He went to learn properly from people who already knew. He took work with a Milanese firm named Franzi, well regarded in those years for fine leather goods and travelling cases, sold to a clientele not so different from the one he had watched arrive at the Savoy. Milan, when he arrived there, was a different kind of city from the Florence he had grown up in. Busier, greyer, more given over to industry and trade than to the old crafts, though the old crafts had not disappeared from it either. Franzi's workshop sat somewhere within that noise, and it was there that Guccio spent his days among tanners and cutters far more practiced than himself, listening more than he spoke, in the way a man does when he knows exactly how much he still has to learn. The courtship with Ada, meanwhile, unfolded back in Florence, in the ordinary way such things unfolded then, through family, through introductions, through a young woman whose own father's trade, tailoring, was not so far removed in spirit from Guccio's. The same close attention to how a thing is cut and fitted and made to sit well on the person who will wear it. The years he spent there were not glamorous, and no one at the time would have called them important. They were years of learning what a hide is, before it becomes anything else, how one skin differs from the next, how a tanner's choices change the way leather will bend, and age, and hold its shape for 50 years, or fall apart in 5. He learned how a case is built from the inside outward. The frame first, then the lining, then the outer skin stretched and fixed and finished, each stage invisible in the finished piece, and each stage the difference between luggage that lasts a lifetime and luggage that does not. He learned, in other words, everything the Savoy had never taught him. Not what fine luggage looked like from the outside, which he already knew by heart, but how it was actually made. It is a slow kind of education, this. Hide by hide, case by case, mistake by mistake, corrected quietly and without fuss. Somewhere in the middle of it, a dream that had been forming since his years in that brass and glass lift cage began, at last, to take on a shape he could hold. Not a shop that sold what other houses made. A shop of his own, in his own city this time, not someone else's, where the two halves of what he had learned could finally meet. An eye for what the world's wealthiest travellers wanted, married to hands that finally knew how to make it. He was no longer a young man in a hurry. He had watched enough, and waited enough, and learned enough to know exactly what he meant to build, before he ever laid the first stone of it. Consider for a moment what he now had, that almost no one else in his position could claim. He had seen at very close range exactly what the wealthiest travellers in Europe carried, and exactly what they were willing to pay for it. And now he had hands that understood from the inside how such a thing was actually built. The hide, the stitching, the frame, the finish. Most men who dream of a shop have only one half of that equation. Guccio, by the time he was ready, had both. It was, in its own quiet way, a rare inheritance for a man whose actual inheritance had amounted to almost nothing at all. In 1921, on a street called Via della Vigna Nuova, in the old heart of Florence, Guccio Gucci opened a shop. It was small. It would be a mistake to picture anything grander than it actually was in those first years. A single narrow room, a counter, a window, and behind the shop, a workshop where the real work of the place was done. In the window at first sat luggage that Guccio had imported from England, the kind of English trunks and fitted cases he had come to know so well in his years at the Savoy. Set alongside pieces made by Tuscan hands in the workshop through the back. Two traditions side by side in the same small window. What the world already trusted and what Guccio believed his own city could learn to make just as well, given the chance. He called it simply a shop of fine leather goods and luggage. There was no grand plan laid out on paper, no vision of the size the business would one day reach. There was only a man in his 40s, doing the thing he had spent 20 years preparing, almost without knowing it, to do. Picture the shop as it would have been on an ordinary morning that first year. The shutters raised, the smell of leather and beeswax settling into the street before the door had even opened properly. A clerk polishing the glass of the counter, and somewhere behind the curtain at the back, the sound of an awl being drawn through hide over and over, unhurried. It was not a large operation, and it did not pretend to be. What it had, from the very first week, was a kind of seriousness about small things. The width of a stitch, the give of a strap, the exact weight of a buckle in the hand, that a passing customer might not have named but would have felt, the way you feel a well-made chair, before you understand why it is comfortable. The first customers who mattered were not travellers at first, but riders. Florence in those years still had a settled equestrian world. Hunting families, riding clubs, the sons and daughters of the Tuscan gentry, who spent as much of their lives on horseback as off it. And it was this world, more than any other, that gave the young shop its earliest and most loyal following. Saddles, bridles, fine leather straps and buckles built to hold under real strain, and not merely to look well in a shop window. The vocabulary of the stable, the curve of a stirrup, the shape of a snaffle bit, the loop of a leather strap threaded through a metal ring, began to work its way into the shop's own designs, long before anyone thought to call it a signature. It simply made sense to a house built by a man who understood leather as something that had to work, and not merely something that had to please the eye. A saddle, after all, is judged by a standard that a handbag never has to meet. It must hold a rider's whole weight, hour after hour, through heat and damp in the ordinary sweat of a working horse, and it must do this for years, without a seam giving way at the wrong moment. Guccio's workshop had learned that standard from the inside, fitting and stitching for a clientele who would notice, immediately and without mercy, if a strap failed under real strain. That same unforgiving standard carried over quietly into wallets and travelling cases, and the small soft bags that fashionable women had only recently begun to carry, gave the shop's ordinary goods a kind of sturdiness that its Florentine neighbours selling for the eye alone did not always match. Aida Calvelli, Guccio's wife, and their growing household lived close by the life of that shop, in the way families did then, when home and work were rarely far apart. There was Ugo, the eldest, born before the marriage and raised as Guccio's own son. There was Grimalda, the only daughter, who would say decades later some of the plainest and most honest things ever said about her family's own myth-making, that whatever the shop windows suggested, the Guccis had never truly been saddle makers themselves, not in the old sense of families who had done nothing else for generations. And there were the boys, Vasco, steadier and quieter than his brothers, willing, so it seemed, to take whatever place in the business was asked of him without ever pushing for a larger one. Then Rodolfo, the youngest, and most consequential of all in these early years, Aldo, born in 1905. Above the shop, and in the rooms behind it, the ordinary rhythm of a large household went on the way it did in most such families then. Aida keeping the accounts of the home even as Guccio kept the accounts of the business, meals taken together when the day allowed it, and the children growing up within earshot of the workshop, so that the sound of an awl through leather or a hammer setting a buckle was simply the sound the house made, the way other households might have had the sound of a piano or a loom. Aldo was, by every account that survives him, a natural at the counter in a way his father was not. Where Guccio had the maker's patience, the tanner's eye, the hours spent learning what a hide could and could not do, Aldo had the seller's instinct, the willingness to talk to a customer as though the sale mattered to him personally, because in his own way it did. He began working alongside his father while still a young man, and it was Aldo, more than anyone else in that first generation, who kept looking past the edges of the shop on Via della Vigna Nuova and asking what lay beyond them. The foreign visitors who came through Florence in those years, English families on the old grand tour, Americans newly rich and eager to be told what good taste looked like, found in Aldo something the shop's craftsmen could never quite offer, a young man who could greet them in a language close enough to their own, who understood what a wealthy stranger wanted before the stranger had finished asking for it, and who never once let a customer feel that a leather satchel was too small a purchase to deserve his full attention. Where his father built the case, Aldo built the moment of buying it, and in a shop that depended, in the end, on people choosing to spend more than they strictly needed to, that moment mattered every bit as much as the stitching. Guccio, the family told it for years afterward, had a saying he returned to often enough that his children could recite it back to him, that the bitterness of poor quality lingers long after the sweetness of a low price is forgotten. It is the kind of line that sounds almost too tidy to be entirely true, the sort of thing families polish smooth with retelling until it is more legend than quotation. But whether or not Guccio said it in precisely those words, on precisely that day, it is not hard to believe he meant something very like it. It was the whole argument of the shop put into a single sentence, that a customer who paid more once for something built to last would remember the house that built it far longer than a customer who saved a little, and was disappointed twice. Rodolfo, the youngest of the sons, wanted none of it for a good long while. He wanted the cinema. As a teenager, he began to slip away from Florence toward the film studios, and by the time he was 17, he had taken a stage name for himself, Maurizio d'Ancora, so that whatever he achieved on screen would stand apart from his father's shop, and whatever he might one day inherit from that shop would stand apart from his life on screen. He would go on to appear in dozens of films over the years that followed, an actor with his own following, entirely apart from the family name printed on the leather goods back home. It was not a rejection of the family, exactly, so much as a young man's insistence on being seen for something he had built himself, before he came anywhere near the thing his father had built. Italian cinema in those years was itself a young, hopeful business, still finding its feet, still working mostly in silence with an orchestra or a single piano to carry the mood of a scene, and a young man with a striking face and a stage name that owed nothing to leather goods could for a while build an entirely different existence within it. He would return to the family firm eventually, later than any of his brothers, and on his own terms. Not yet. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, the shop grew the way sound businesses grow when they are patient about it, steadily and mostly by reputation rather than advertisement. Word travelled among the sort of clientele who could afford to be particular, and who talked to one another, and it was Aldo, pushing harder than his father might have on his own, who first looked beyond Florence entirely. In 1938, Aldo opened a second shop, this time in Rome, on the Via Condotti, a street built for exactly this kind of ambition, lined with the sort of storefronts that the wealthiest visitors to the city already knew to walk past slowly. It was a considerable step for a family firm that had, less than 2 decades before, been a single room on a side street in Florence. Alongside the leather goods and the luggage, the Rome shop carried smaller pieces too. Gloves, belts, wallets, small leather cases for keys. The beginnings of a wider range of things a person might carry, rather than merely one great case for a single long journey. Rome was a different proposition from Florence entirely. Via Condotti sat almost in the shadow of the Spanish Steps, a short straight street already given over to the kind of shopping that existed for its own sake, rather than out of any strict need. A street where the wealthiest visitors to the city went to be seen looking, whether or not they meant to buy. Placing a shop there was, in its own quiet way, a statement that the Gucci name was no longer only a Florentine matter, known to a settled local clientele, but something the family meant to put in front of travellers who might never set foot in Florence at all, and would meet the name for the first time on a fashionable Roman street instead. But before that expansion could settle into something comfortable, the ground under the whole business shifted. In 1935, Italy invaded Abyssinia, and the League of Nations answered with sanctions, an embargo meant to squeeze the country economically, in the hope of forcing a retreat that never came. For a business built almost entirely on leather, imported in large part from outside Italy, the effect was direct and immediate. Hides became scarce. What could still be found became costly, rationed, uncertain from one month to the next. The government of the day was, at the very same time, pushing its own citizens toward what it called self-sufficiency. The idea that Italy ought to make do, wherever possible, with only what Italy itself could grow, weave, or tan. For a leather house, the two pressures arrived together, and neither one was going to lift on its own. A lesser workshop might simply have made less, and waited for the trouble to pass. The Gucci workshop instead began to improvise, and some of what it improvised under pressure would outlast the sanctions themselves by the better part of a century. The family turned to a tannery near Santa Croce, already skilled in treating Tuscan calfskin, the fatty, heavily worked way that came to be known, within the trade, as cuoio grasso, dense and supple in a way that made the most of a hide when hides themselves were hard to come by. And for the parts of a bag or a case that leather could no longer cover, the workshop turned to something else entirely. A heavy woven canvas made by hemp weavers, printed with a small, dense, interlocking diamond pattern in a dark tone against a pale ground. It was not, at the time, meant to be beautiful in its own right. It was meant to be a way of making a great deal of good material stretch across a season of very little of it. The canvas itself came off the loom in long, plain bolts, and it was only once the small diamond stencil had been pressed across it, over and over, in that dark repeating line, that it stopped looking like a substitute forced on the workshop by scarcity, and started looking, almost by accident, like a pattern someone had chosen on purpose. It became, in time, one of the most recognized patterns the house would ever make, though that recognition was still decades away. In 1935, it was simply what a family workshop did when the thing it was built on had suddenly become scarce. It looked sideways at hemp instead of hide, and found a way to keep the doors open. The sanctions on Italy would not go on forever. But scarcity, once it teaches a workshop to improvise, rarely leaves entirely when the shortage does. And harder years than these, years that would test the family far more than an embargo ever could, were still ahead of them, waiting at the edge of the coming decade, though no one standing in that Florentine workshop in 1935 could have known it yet. By the early 1940s, the workshop on Via della Vigna Nuova had already learned to make do. You will remember the cuoio grasso, the greased calfskin standing in for finer hides, the hemp canvas, woven in its small diamond pattern, standing in for leather altogether. That was the first scarcity. What came next was worse. The war did not arrive in Florence all at once. It arrived the way weather arrives, first as rumour, then as ration books, then as absence. Leather was needed for boots, for harness, for 100 uses the army claimed before any tradesman could. What hides did reach the tanneries went first to soldiers, and only what was left. And there was less every season than the season before, came to the men who still, somehow, kept a workshop open and its lamps lit after dark. There were forms to fill in those years, before a tradesman could so much as buy a length of thread. Quotas were set for who might purchase what and how much and how often. And a workshop that had once chosen its hides by eye, turning a skin over in the window light to judge its grain, now took what the quota allowed and made the most of it. Fuel for the workshop stove was rationed too, so the lamps burned low, and the hands working by them learned to see by less light than they once had. Bolts of good cloth for lining a bag, dye for finishing a hide, even the wax for the thread. All of it grew scarcer, month on month, until scarcity itself became simply how the trade was practiced. Guccio was an old man by then, in his 60s, watching a war for the second time in his life. He had known scarcity before in his own early years, learning a trade with almost nothing behind him. He knew, from that, perhaps better than a younger man would have, that shortage was not the end of a trade. It was only a different set of rules. So the workshop went on, quietly and with less. The awls were sharpened on the same stones. The waxed thread was pulled through the same iron guides. Only the materials underneath the stitching had changed, and would go on changing as the war tightened, into things stranger still. The story goes that in the workshop, in those years, nothing was thrown away. Every offcut of hide, every length of cord, every scrap of material that might once have gone into the bin was kept, sorted, considered again. A tradesman who has run short of the thing he was trained to work with does not stop working. He only starts looking, more carefully than before, at everything within reach. Then the front came to the city itself. By the summer of 1944, the German army was retreating north through Tuscany, with the Allied advance behind it, and Florence stood directly in the path of that retreat. The city had escaped the worst of the bombing that had fallen on other Italian towns. But no army retreats without trying to slow the one behind it, and a retreating army, in that war, slowed its pursuers with bridges. Tell it quietly, the way it happened. In the first days of August, engineers went out along the Arno at night and set their charges under every crossing in the city. One by one, in the dark, the bridges of Florence went down into the river. The Ponte Santa Trinita, delicate as a piece of jewellery, fell in pieces into the water. The Ponte alla Carraia fell. The Ponte alla Grazie, older than memory, fell. 5 principal road bridges, gone in the space of one night, and the water ran over the wreckage of all of them. One bridge was left standing. The Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge, lined with its goldsmiths' shops, the one crossing every visitor to the city already knew by sight, was spared. Nobody in the workshop that week could have told you why, and the reasons, even now, are told more than one way. An order passed down from high in the German command, so the story goes that the bridge was too fine a thing to destroy, or simply that its narrow ancient span was of no use to tanks in any case. Both may be true. What is certain is only this. The buildings at either end of it were dynamited instead, so that the rubble itself would block the crossing, and for a while nobody could reach the one bridge left whole. Florence, that August, was a city cut into pieces by its own river, with a single door left standing and no way to walk through it. In the days that followed, those who remained in the city moved between its halves however they could, over the rubble or not at all. The goldsmith's shutters on the old bridge stayed shut. The workshop on Via della Vigna Nuova stood on the near side of the river from the worst of the wreckage, near enough to have felt the ground move on the night the charges went off, far enough to still be standing when the dust settled. Word travelled slowly in a city with half its crossings gone, and it would have been days, at least, before anyone at the workshop learned which of the old bridges were lost, and which single one, against all sense, remained. The workshop stood back from the water, and its walls held. When the front moved on, north toward the last of the fighting, the building was still there. So was the sign above the door. So, in a manner of speaking, was the family. Peace, when it came the following spring, did not bring leather with it. That is worth saying plainly, because it is easy to imagine an ending to a war, as an ending to every hardship that came with it, and it was not. Italy, in the years after 1945, was a country short of almost everything. Short of currency, short of food in places, short of the raw materials that any workshop needs to call itself a workshop. Hides remained scarce and expensive, and hard to come by in the quantities a growing business would have wanted. But the shops reopened. Florence began, slowly, to fill again with visitors. Soldiers first, in uniform, with money to spend and little to spend it on. Then, as the years passed, travellers of an older and gentler kind, the sort who had once come to see the city's paintings, and now came, as well, to see what its workshop still made by hand. The house that Guccio had built kept its doors open through all of it, working with what it had. And what it had still was not enough leather. Money itself was strange in those years too. The old currency had been battered by the war until it barely held its worth from one week to the next, and a family business had to be run, for a time, on a kind of patient improvisation. Taking payment where it could, in whatever form a customer offered, and trusting that the workshop's name would still be worth something once the country had settled again. It did settle in time the way countries do. Rome sent aid, factories reopened, and into the space that recovery slowly cleared, a small leather goods house from Florence began, quietly, to grow larger than it had ever been before. It was out of that same shortage, the one that had already given the workshop its greased calfskin and its diamond-patterned canvas, that its most enduring answer arrived. In 1947, the workshop began fitting its handbags, with handles made not of hide, but of bamboo. Cane, imported and shaped by hand, bent into a curve no scrap leather could have managed, and no ration book could touch, because it was not leather at all. We will look closely at how that handle was made a little further on, in its own chapter, because it deserves the attention. For now it is enough to know this. The bag that would go on to outlast every fashion that followed it, the bag people would one day simply call the bamboo, was born the way so much in this house was born. Not from a plan, but from having nothing else to work with, and refusing to stop working. The house grew again through those years, the way a tree grows after a hard winter. Slowly at first, then faster than anyone quite noticed. New premises opened, new hands were taken on. Guccio's sons, there were 4 of them by now, working alongside him. Aldo the eldest, then Vasco, then Rodolfo, then Ugo, who would in time step away from the business, were no longer boys learning a trade at their father's elbow. They were grown men, each finding his own place in the house, and it was Aldo, restless and ambitious in a way his father had been at the same age, who began to look past Florence, past Rome, past Italy itself, toward a country that had barely known the war at all, and had money to spend. Aldo had first crossed the ocean before the war, on a visit that showed him how little the Americans knew of Florentine leather, and how much, given the chance, they might come to want it. He carried that thought for years, through the fighting, through the shortages, and did not let it go. By the early 1950s he had made up his mind. A shop of their own in New York, on the same avenue as the finest names in the city. His father, the story goes, was not entirely persuaded. Guccio had built his name on Italian ground, and an ocean between the workshop and its newest shop was, to a man of his generation, a great deal of trust to place in a country he barely knew. But Aldo went ahead regardless, the way a son sometimes must, carrying his father's name to a city his father had never seen, and betting that the name alone would be enough to open a door on a street where it had never once been spoken. By then, Guccio already knew what his son intended for America. Aldo had pressed the plan on him for years, the ambition of carrying the family name to a country the old man had never once set foot in, and in the end, Guccio gave it his blessing. Reluctantly, the story goes, but he gave it all the same. On the 2nd of January, 1953, Guccio Gucci died in Milan. He was 71 by most accounts, though the family's own memory of the date wavered by a year in the telling, the way such things often do. He had built a business from a bellboy's memory of good luggage and better manners, carried it through one war, then a second, then years of doing without. He did not live to see the doors open. Later that same year, in November, his sons carried the ambition he had blessed across the ocean at last, and opened Gucci's first American boutique on Fifth Avenue in New York. There was a daughter too. Grimalda, the only girl among Guccio's 6 children, had grown up in the same house, watched the same workshop take shape, and was given no place in it. The business, when her father's estate was settled, passed entirely to her brothers. It was the ordinary unfairness of its age, told without relish here, because there is no need for relish in a fact so plain. A daughter set aside, in a family firm, simply for being a daughter. It was not spoken of as a wrong at the time. It would be spoken of by later generations as one of the quieter costs of how the house was built. No workshop keeps an account of what it cost the people left outside it. Grimalda's name does not appear on the shop front, or on the label, or in the ledgers her brothers kept from that year forward. She had grown up among the same wax thread and the same lamp oil as her brothers, in the same rooms, and none of it in the end was judged to belong to her. It is a small thing to set beside a war and a bridge, and a bag invented out of nothing, but it belongs in the account all the same, told plainly and left to stand. What Guccio left then passed to 3 sons who remained bound to the business: Aldo, Vasco, and Rodolfo, with Ugo already gone his own way. 3 brothers, each with his own temperament, each with his own idea of what the family name ought to become, standing now at the head of a house their father had spent his whole life building, in a city he had just been laid to rest in, with an ocean already crossed and a great deal of the 20th century still ahead of them. For the moment, though, they held it together. That is where this chapter leaves them. 3 men, 1 name, 1 workshop, still smelling of lamp oil and hemp, and the last of the good leather standing quietly at the door their father had opened, and had not lived to see fully through. Outside, Florence was rebuilding its bridges, one at a time, in the same stone as before. Inside, the workshop went on turning hide and cane and canvas into the same small, careful pieces it had always made. A little steadier now, a little more prosperous, and carrying, whether the brothers spoke of it or not, the weight of everything the years just past had asked of it. Sit with this a while, because it rewards the sitting. You are at a workbench in Florence, and in front of you lies a length of bamboo, pale gold, no thicker than a finger. It has come a long way to reach this bench. Cane like this was brought in from far outside Italy, chosen for its straightness and its grain, cut into lengths and set aside to dry before anyone touches it with a blade. You pick 1 length up. It is lighter than you expect. It is also, you will learn, far less forgiving than leather. Leather can be coaxed, eased, persuaded into a shape over hours. Cane will not be persuaded. It must be asked properly, with heat, or it will simply break. Not every length that arrives at the bench is fit for the work. A trained eye runs along each one before it is cut, looking for the faint irregularities that would show themselves later as weakness. A knot too near where the curve must bend, a grain that runs slightly askew, a surface marked by insects or damp in the long weeks of drying. Whole bundles are set aside this way, kept back for lesser uses, while only the straightest, cleanest lengths go forward to become a handle. It is slow, careful work, choosing a plant to stand in for a hide, and it is done exactly as carefully as choosing the hide itself would have been in the years when there was hide enough to choose. So you light a small flame, low and steady, and you hold the cane above it, not in the fire, but near enough to feel its heat traveling into the fibers. You turn it slowly, the way you might turn a spit, watching the surface darken by degrees. And somewhere in that slow turning, the cane begins to give. It bends. Not all at once, and not evenly if you rush it, but if your hand is patient and your flame is steady, the straight length in your fingers becomes a curve, a single, unbroken arc, the shape of a saddle's cantle, the shape a handle needs to be. This is worth pausing on, because it's easy to let a detail like this pass by unremarked, and it should not. Its bamboo handle emerged during the post-war shortage, when traditional raw materials were difficult to obtain and the workshop was experimenting with alternatives. Nobody sat down in a design studio and decided that bamboo would look well against a woman's arm. a workshop short of hide, in a country short of almost everything, began experimenting with cane instead, because cane could be found where hide could not, and a bag still needed a handle whatever the times were, doing outside the door. Once bent, the cane is not finished. It is coated, layer over layer, in a lacquer that darkens as it dries, until the pale gold of the raw cane deepens into something closer to tortoise shell, a warm, mottled brown. The surface polished until it catches the light, the way old varnished wood catches the light in a church that has stood for centuries. Each coat must be allowed to dry fully before the next goes on, and between coats the handle is set aside on a rack, with a dozen others, curing quietly in the workshop air, while other hands move on to other work. Only when the lacquer has built up enough depth is the surface finally polished, by hand, with a soft cloth, until the dull sheen of drying varnish gives way to something closer to glass. Each handle is finished this way, and no two, if you look closely enough, are ever quite identical. The body of the bag, beneath that handle, is built the old way, the way every good bag in this house has always been built. The leather is cut and assembled and stitched by hand, panel to panel, by artisans who have done this so many times that their hands no longer need telling what comes next. It is careful work, unhurried work, the kind that asks for hours of a single pair of hands before it is finished. The bamboo handle is set onto the finished body last, fitted into a curve at the top and closed with a small turn lock, so that the whole bag, cane and hide together, appears, if you know to look, as a small piece of harness, adapted to be carried rather than worn. That is the bamboo bag. Born in 1947, out of a shortage nobody would have chosen, and still, all these years later, made in very nearly the same slow way. Now step away from the workbench for a moment, and look instead at a shoe. In 1953, the same year the doors opened in New York, the same year that ends the last chapter, the workshop made a loafer unlike any that had come before it. It was a soft moccasin, unlined in places where other shoes of the day were stiffened and boned, built to slip onto the foot the way a glove slips onto a hand. And across the instep, where another maker might have set a plain strip of leather or a simple buckle, this shoe carried something else. A small brass fitting, two rings joined by a short bar, the same shape a snaffle bit takes where it meets a horse's mouth. It was a strange thing to put on a shoe, if you had never spent time around horses. It was the most natural thing in the world if you had. The house had grown from its first years, out of an idea of travel and of riding. Luggage for trunks carried by horse and carriage, harness fittings borrowed and adapted long before anyone in the workshop had ever cut a shoe. The bit across the instep was not decoration invented from nothing. It was the vocabulary the workshop already spoke, applied to a new kind of item. A bit belongs on a bridle. A girth belongs on a saddle. A stirrup belongs beneath a rider's foot. And now, in 1953, a fragment of a bridle belonged too, on the top of a shoe. Making the shoe well was harder than it looked. A snaffle bit is a rigid, unforgiving thing, and setting it flat across a soft moccasin without the leather puckering, or the fitting sitting crooked once the shoe had been worn a season, took a craftsman's eye as much as the bending of the bamboo did. The leather itself was chosen for its softness rather than its stiffness, cut low at the sides so the foot could move as freely as if it wore no shoe at all, and stitched at the front in the plain, hand-gathered seam a moccasin has always worn. Comfort in this shoe was not an afterthought. It was the entire idea, with the brass fitting laid over the top of it, almost as a signature. The shoe found its audience quickly and kept it for decades in a way few shoes of any era manage. It was worn by people who had never sat a horse in their lives, and it did not matter. The reference had become its own language, understood without needing to be explained, the way the harp on a bottle needs no explaining to a drinker who has never set foot in Ireland. It travelled well beyond the world that had inspired it. into offices and drawing rooms, and wardrobes that had nothing whatsoever to do with a stable. By the end of the 1960s, tens of thousands of pairs a year were leaving the workshop for America alone, more than any single shoe the house had made before it, and the little brass bit across the instep had become, for a great many people who owned one, the whole reason for the purchase. Years afterward, a later pair of these loafers, dating to about 1972, came to rest under glass in New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, kept as an example of a design so complete in its era that nothing since has needed to improve on it. A shoe, worn to walk in, considered good enough to stand still in a museum instead. There is one more mark from these years worth carrying with you, and it is smaller than the bag, smaller than the shoe, and just as stubborn. Somewhere in the years either side of 1950, a stripe appeared on the house's canvas and webbing. 2 bands of green, with a single band of red running between them, woven tight enough to survive a lifetime of use as luggage straps and belt fittings. Ask where it came from, and the answer takes you back, again, to the stable rather than the shop floor. A saddle is held to a horse by a girth, a broad woven band that passes under the belly and buckles at both sides, and girths of that kind, in the stables Guccio himself had grown up around, were very often striped. Bands of colour woven in for strength and for recognition, so that a groom could tell one horse's tack from another at a glance across a crowded yard. There is no single settled account of why green and red, of all the colours a girth might carry, were the 2 chosen. Some who have told the story point to the colours of the flag of the country the workshop stood in. Others point further away, to the hunting fields of England, and the green of open pasture set against the red of a huntsman's coat. Both explanations are plausible, and neither can be proven beyond the telling, so hold them both loosely, side by side, the way the 2 colours themselves sit side by side in the weave. What is certain is only the result: a narrow, sturdy little stripe, easy to spot at a distance, hard to mistake for any other house's work. The house took that plain, practical stripe and set it onto luggage and belts and later a good deal else, and it has never entirely left since. A stable fitting, worn now by people who have never mucked out a stall in their lives and do not need to. The last of these marks came later still, once Aldo had taken the firmest hand in shaping how the world would recognize the family name. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, 2 letters began repeating across the house's canvas, over and over, in a small, tight pattern. A G facing one way, and a second G facing the other, printed close together as a design that needed no further explanation once you had seen it. Then, in the 1970s, the same 2 letters were cast in brass, freestanding this time rather than printed, locked together at the curve as a single piece of hardware, fitted to buckles and clasps in their own right. There is a kind of quiet symmetry in that choice, if you sit with it a moment. A house that had spent its whole life turning shortage into shape, cane standing in for hide, a bit borrowed from a bridle, a girth stripe borrowed for a strap, now turned to its own founder's name and did the same thing to that. Gucci had no need of shortage by then. The house had grown well past it. But the habit of taking one plain thing and turning it, patiently, into something else, had by then become simply how the family thought. A letter doubled, facing itself. The letters honoured no one but the old man himself. Gucci, dead by the time the printed pattern first appeared, was given back his own initial, doubled, and set to travel further than he ever had in life. Onto canvas, and later onto brass hardware of its own, a signature that was not a signature at all, only his own letter, facing itself forever. Hold all of it together for a moment, the way you might hold several small stones in one hand. A handle bent from cane because there was no hide left to spare. A bit lifted from a bridle and set onto a shoe. A stripe lifted from a girth and set onto a strap. A pair of letters, joined, standing in for a man who was no longer there to sign anything himself. None of it came from nowhere. Each piece came from somewhere the family already knew. The stable, the tack room, the workshop bench, carried indoors and set down gently, onto cloth and leather and brass, to be carried by people who would never once need to think about where any of it began. You do not need to remember the years, only the shapes, the curve of the bent cane, the small bright bit across the instep, the stripe running between two bands of green, the two letters facing each other, holding on. They will still be there in the morning, and so, in their way, will you. By the 1950s, the name had found its city, not Florence, where the leather was cut and stitched, Rome, and on Rome's grandest shopping street, Via Condotti, running straight as a ruler from the Spanish Steps down toward the river. The house had taken a shop with a curved glass door, rounded at the corner like the prow of a small ship. Cars idled outside it in the evenings. Something in that street's particular light, gold and worn and old, seemed made for handbags and shoes. Not far from that shop, on the edges of the city, the film studios of Cinecittà were running at full stretch through these same years, so many productions passing through them that people had taken to calling Rome, only half in jest, Hollywood on the Tiber. Actors flew in for a picture and stayed for a season. Directors kept rooms at the same few hotels, year after year. And when the cameras stopped rolling for the evening, a good number of that travelling crowd drifted the short distance to Via Condotti, still half in costume and spirit if not in fact, looking for something soft and well-made to carry home. This was Rome in its most photographed decade. The world had a phrase for it by now, borrowed from a film that would soon define the whole era once it appeared. La Dolce Vita, the sweet life. Actors and directors and minor royalty drifted through the city in those years, the way weather drifts through a valley, arriving without announcement, settling for a season, moving on. And more than a few of them, sooner or later, found their way to that curved glass door. You do not need to picture any one of them clearly. That is not how it worked, and it is not how you should picture it now. Think instead of a hotel lobby late at night. Low lamps, deep chairs, a hush of quiet conversation, and figures crossing through it, recognizable for a moment in outline, then gone into the dark beyond the doorway. That is the register of this whole part of the house's story. Names drifting past, weather, not headlines. One of those names belonged to a princess. In the spring of 1966, so the story is generally told, Grace Kelly, once an actress, by then Princess of Monaco, visited one of the house's shops, and the family that ran it wanted a gift worthy of her. The decision fell, it seems, to Rodolfo Gucci, one of the founder's sons, and a man who understood the theatre of a gesture better than most. Rodolfo had, in his own younger years, been an actor himself, under a stage name borrowed for the screen rather than the family ledger, appearing in a great many pictures before he ever came back to the leather business at all. It is not hard to imagine why a former actor, watching a princess who had once been an actress too, would want to mark the moment with something more than a polite handshake. Rodolfo turned to an illustrator who had been quietly designing for the house for some seasons already. A painter named Vittorio Accornero, trained in the old schools, already old himself by then, with a long career behind him illustrating fairy tales and adventure stories for the great Italian publishing houses, and years spent designing costumes and sets for the cinema and for the opera house at La Scala, before Rodolfo brought him across into silk and fashion. He had, in other words, spent a lifetime dressing other people's stories before he was ever asked to dress this one. He had a gift for flowers and birds and the soft geometry of Renaissance painting, and it was this gift the house now asked him to put to use. Accornero set to work on a square of silk. He filled it with flowers, dozens of them, layered and overlapping, no single bloom repeating exactly, and threaded butterflies between the petals, so that the whole design seemed to breathe very slowly if you watched it long enough. Some who study these things see an echo of an older painting in it, the kind with a young woman standing in a springtime meadow, flowers scattered at her feet and rising from her hem. A painting every Florentine child grows up walking past. Whether a Cornero meant that echo or simply arrived at the same well of flowers that older painting had drawn from, nobody can say for certain now. But the name he gave his scarf was Flora, and Flora, in the old telling, is the goddess of the flowering world, which suited a piece of silk covered quite simply in every bloom he could imagine. To print it took extraordinary patience. Specialist printers in Milan, expert in a slow, layered method of printing colour onto colour, laid down more than 30 separate colours, one careful shade at a time, each one requiring the fabric to dry and settle before the next could be laid over it. Dozens of passes in the end, before the scarf was finished. A single square of silk made the unhurried way, the way everything in this house had once been made. It became, in time, one of the most enduring things the house would ever produce. But that is a story for a later part of the night. For now, picture only the princess, and the silk, and the flowers laid down one slow colour at a time, by hands that had learned patience from painting long before they learned it from fashion. Another name belonged to a first lady. Some years before Grace Kelly's scarf, in 1961, the house had put out a new kind of bag. Curved rather than square, with a soft crescent body and a single loop handle, easy to carry folded under one arm without a clasp catching or a corner digging in. There was, in that curve, an echo of everything the house already knew how to make. The same soft roundness that had shaped a saddle strap into a shoulder handle. The same instinct, learned from bridles and stirrup leathers, for a line that bends rather than a line that simply meets itself at a corner. It sold well enough at first, quietly, the way most useful things do. Then, through the 1960s, a particular woman was photographed carrying it again and again. Jacqueline Kennedy, first as the wife of a president, and then, after loss, in the long years that followed, was rarely without one. The story goes that in New York, followed everywhere by photographers, she once raised the bag to shield her face from the cameras rather than turn away, and that the picture, printed and reprinted everywhere, did more for the bag's name than any advertisement could have managed. Whether that particular moment happened exactly as it is remembered, or whether it simply crystallized something that had already been building for years, of photographs, is hard to say at this distance. What is certain is that the bag stopped being known by its own catalogue name not long afterwards, and became, in shops and in magazines, and eventually in the house's own records, simply the Jackie. Other names drifted through the same years, more lightly, leaving less behind them to be certain of. Elizabeth Taylor was seen, more than once, carrying the house's soft bamboo-handled bags. Audrey Hepburn moved through the same world of scarves and gloves that every woman of her standing moved through in that decade, though which particular pieces were hers to keep, and which were simply worn for an evening and returned, memory does not preserve with much precision. None of them needed to say a word about where their bag or their scarf had come from. The small metal clasp, shaped like the bit from a horse's bridle, and the narrow red and green stripe running along a strap, had by now become recognizable enough on their own, glimpsed for half a second as a car door closed or a hand reached for a cigarette. Take these names the way you would take the last unhurried voices you hear before sleep, the present and pleasant and not to be examined too closely. While Rome played host to the Dolce Vita, the eldest of the founder's sons was an ocean away, building something else entirely. Aldo Gucci had crossed the Atlantic in the early 1950s, before any of this glamour had properly gathered, and opened a shop beneath a grand hotel on Fifth Avenue in New York. In the same year, his father died. The timing carried its own quiet sorrow. The old founder, Guccio, who had begun this whole story as a young man watching trunks carried onto ships, had died in Milan early that year, months before the doors on Fifth Avenue ever opened. So that the house's arrival in America and the death of the man who had first dreamed it belonged to the very same year, though he did not live to see the one follow the other. Within the decade, Aldo had moved the shop to a still grander address on the same avenue, beside one of the city's most storied hotels, and the family name was, by then, unmistakably a fixture of that street. Chicago followed, then a shop for the winter crowd on the Florida coast, where the wealthy of the American Northeast kept second houses and longer holidays. Each new address was chosen the same way Guccio himself had once chosen his first Florence shopfront. Not for the cheapest rent, but for the street where the right people already happened to be walking. Aldo was not a quiet man, and he did not run his corner of the business the way a workshop runs. Where Florence had given the house its patience, Aldo gave it noise, in the best sense of the word. Openings, receptions, photographers of his own inviting. A showman's instinct for making sure a room noticed the moment he entered it. He dressed the part completely, always turned out in the same soft, exact tailoring the house itself produced, as though he were simply another well-made object carrying the name into a room. He understood better than anyone else in the family that an Italian craft house selling to Americans was really selling something larger than luggage or shoes. He was selling Florence itself. The light of it, the slowness of it, the centuries behind every stitch, wrapped into a shop window on a cold American avenue. The story goes that an American president, meeting him once at a reception in Washington, told him he was the first true Italian ambassador the country had ever needed. It is the kind of line a showman would happily have said about himself, and perhaps that alone should make you hold it loosely. True or not, it fit him well enough that people kept repeating it for the rest of his life, and Aldo, by every account, never once tired of hearing it repeated. The world Aldo was selling into was itself changing shape. For most of the house's history, its customers had crossed oceans slowly, by ship, with steamer trunks built for weeks at sea and cabins to be dressed for dinner in. By the 1960s, that had nearly ended. The great liners were being retired, one by one, and in their place came the jet, a machine that could cross the same ocean in a single afternoon. Airports rose to meet it, vast halls of glass and steel quite unlike any railway station or shipping pier that had come before, humming with an unhurried glamour all their own. Where a departure once meant streamers and a band on the quay, and a slow evening of watching the coastline fall away, it now meant a quiet lounge, a cup of coffee, and a window filled with cloud before the coffee had even cooled. Into these bright new halls stepped a new kind of traveller. Journalists gave them a name, the jet set, a loose, glittering, constantly moving company of the wealthy and the famous, who thought no more of breakfast in Rome and dinner in New York than their grandparents had thought of a carriage ride across town. And what this jet set carried through the glass and steel of those halls, again and again, cameras happened to catch. Soft leather holdalls with a red and green stripe running down the centre, small cases with a distinctive clasp, luggage that looked, even moving quickly through a crowded terminal, as though it had all the time in the world. The house that had begun by watching trunks loaded onto ships now found its bags gliding through departure halls it could never have imagined, carried by people crossing the world for pleasure rather than passage. By 1968, Aldo had planted the family name on the American coast, opposite New York as well, opening a shop on a palm-lined street in Beverly Hills that would soon draw a different kind of celebrity through its doors. Film people this time, rather than royalty, but drawn by the same soft, unhurried glamour that had first taken hold of Rome. The street outside that shop had, until only a few years before, been a quiet residential lane of orange groves and modest bungalows. By the time Aldo's name went up above the door, It was already becoming the single most watched shopping street in America, and the house had arrived early enough to help make it so, rather than simply following the crowd there afterwards. Between the two coasts and the ocean between them, and Rome further still, the house's name had, by the end of that decade, become something closer to weather than to a shop. It was simply there, in the background of the era's most photographed lives, the way good light is there in a photograph nobody thinks to credit. The parties will carry on for some years yet, in Rome and in New York, and in the palm-lit evenings of the American coast. But even as the flashbulbs kept popping and the champagne kept coming, the real work of this house was still happening somewhere much quieter, in a city of narrow streets and old stone, where none of this glamour had ever really been the point at all. Every scarf a princess ever wore, every curved bag a first lady ever carried, every hold-all that ever slid through the glass of a new airport had begun, long before any camera found it, on a bench, in the hands of someone whose name none of the magazines would ever think to print. Cross the river now, and leave the parties behind. On the far bank of the Arno, away from the grand shops and the wide streets where the tourists gather, lies a quarter the Florentines have always called simply the Oltrarno, the far side. Narrow lanes, shuttered windows, workshops set into the ground floors of buildings that have stood since long before any of this story began. Goldsmiths have worked this side of the river for centuries, and so have carpenters and framers, and, longer than almost anyone, workers in leather. The trade's settling here, generation upon generation, the way silt settles at the bend of a slow river. This is where the house's real work has always happened, quietly, while Rome entertained its princesses and Aldo entertained New York. You are standing at a bench here now. It is old wood, scarred and stained dark by decades of handling, worn into a slight hollow where countless elbows have rested before yours. Laid along its edge, in a neat row that never seems to move from its place, are the tools of the trade, and all its point worn to a soft gleam. A paring knife, thin as a leaf, for shaving leather down to a whisper where a seam must fold. A wooden former, smoothed by years of palms. Small things, none of them expensive, all of them irreplaceable to the hand that has learned them. A single lamp burns above the bench. The air smells of leather and wax, and somewhere behind you, of coffee kept warm on a small stove in the corner. Nobody hurries in this room. Nobody has ever hurried in this room. Watch the man at the next bench, and you will begin to understand why. Before a single stitch is made, the holes themselves must be set. A line of small, even openings marked along the edge of the leather with a wheel or a gauge, then pierced one at a time with the awl, each one angled the same careful few degrees as the last, so that the finished seam will sit straight rather than wander. This alone can take longer than the stitching that follows it. Only once the line of holes is set does he thread his needles. Two of them, not one, tied to either end of a single length of linen cord that he has drawn, again and again, through a block of beeswax until it holds a faint golden sheen. He passes one needle through a hole already pierced in the leather, then the other needle through the same hole from the far side, so that the two threads cross inside the skins and pull tight against each other. Stitch by stitch, he works his way along the seam. Push, cross, pull, push, cross, pull, the rhythm settling into something almost like breathing. It is called saddle stitching, and it is older than this house, older than the shop on Via Condotti, older than the family name itself. The old craft of the saddlers who worked this same quarter of Florence long before any Gucci arrived among them. Patient hands passing two needles through the same hole from opposite sides so that a seam might hold at every stitch on its own. It is this tradition, more than any single procedure fixed to a single workbench, that the house grew out of and has never quite let go of. The belief, older than any label, that a thing joined slowly by hand is a thing that answers for itself, stitch by stitch, however far it later travels from this room. Further along the bench, someone is finishing an edge. The rough cut side of a piece of leather, left untreated, will fray and darken with wear, the way the frayed hem of an old coat will. So the edge is trimmed with a small blade until it is perfectly even, then sealed. A thin band of coloured wax worked into the raw fibres with repeated patient strokes, until the edge takes on a faint shine, glass smooth to the fingertip. Then comes the burnishing, a rounded tool, sometimes bone, sometimes polished wood, sometimes no more than the heel of a steady palm, drawn back and forth along the sealed edge with real pressure behind it, warming the wax with friction until it sets hard and gleams like the rim of a well-kept shoe. It is patient, repetitive work, the same short stroke made 100 times over on a single edge no longer than a hand, and there is no shortcut through it that does not show itself later, in a duller line or a rougher touch. Do this well, and an edge will outlast the leather around it. Do it badly, and the whole piece will look unfinished no matter how fine the hide inside it happens to be. The room holds these smells the way old houses hold the smell of wood smoke long after the fire has gone out. Warm hide, beeswax, sweet and faintly smoky. Coffee, made strong in small cups, drunk standing at the bench without much ceremony. If you closed your eyes in this room and were asked to guess the decade, you might struggle to answer with any confidence at all. This room could belong to nearly any year in the house's whole history. That, in its own quiet way, is the point of it. Look now toward the far end of the room, where an older man stands beside a much younger one, guiding his hands rather than his own. This trade has always passed down through families, the way it does in most crafts that survive long enough to be called traditions. A father teaches a son or a daughter the particular pressure of the awl, the particular angle of the blade, the small private habits that never make it into any manual because they were never written down in the first place, only shown hand over hand at this same bench, under this same kind of lamp. Some of the men and women working in rooms like this one have stood at their benches for 30 years, some for 40. They arrived as apprentices, sweeping shavings and fetching thread, and grew slowly, over patient seasons, into the ones now doing the guiding. A workshop like this one is not one trade but several, quietly divided among the people who work it. There is the one who cuts the hide, reading its grain and its faint natural marks the way another person might read a map, choosing which piece of skin becomes which part of which finished thing, so that no flaw ever ends up where a hand will rest. There is the one who closes a piece, joining its parts before it takes its final shape. There is the one who stitches, and the one who finishes the edges, and the one, often the eldest in the room, who does nothing all day but inspect what the others have made, running a thumb along every seam before it is allowed to leave the bench. No single person makes the whole object alone. It passes from hand to hand across the room, the way a story passes from mouth to mouth down a family, gaining a little more care at every stage. There is a particular quiet to a room full of people who have done the same careful work for decades. It is not the quiet of boredom. It is closer to the quiet of a chapel or a library. A hush that comes from everyone present understanding, without needing to say so, that the work in front of them deserves their whole attention and will still be there tomorrow expecting exactly the same. The apprentice sweeping shavings in the corner doesn't yet know which of these benches will one day be his own. He knows only the broom and the smell of the wax and the low murmur of men and women who seem never to look up from what their hands are doing, and yet somehow always know exactly what is happening at every other bench in the room. He will be doing this same sweeping for longer than feels fair to him now. In time, though, someone will hand him an awl instead of a broom, and show him once the angle it wants, and he will spend the rest of his working life discovering how much was folded into that one small lesson. The day in a room like this has its own shape, and it has held that shape for a very long time. It begins early, with the shutters folded back and the first grey light coming in, low across the benches, before the lamps are even needed. Coffee is made, Tools are checked, the awls for sharpness, the needles for wear, the wax for its warmth. The morning is given to the finest work, while eyes are freshest and hands steadiest, the delicate stitching and the careful edges that cannot be rushed under any light. Voices are low at this hour, mostly practical. A question about a measurement, a request passed down the bench. The soft, ordinary business of people who have worked beside each other for years and no longer need many words to do it. By midday there is bread and a little wine for some, and talk that has nothing to do with leather at all. Football, the weather, a cousin's wedding, the price of everything. The room empties a little, chairs pushed back, and for a short while the only sound left in it is a fly somewhere near the window and the distant hum of the street outside. Then the bench again, through the long, slow hours of the afternoon, while the light outside moves from white to gold to something close to amber, and the knocking and scraping of the morning gives way to quieter, more careful work. The last stitches, the final polish, the pieces that must be finished before the light fails, rather than begun fresh under it. And somewhere near evening, a bell across the rooftops of the quarter marks the day's proper end, the way it has marked it for longer than anyone at these benches can remember. Not far from here, in an upstairs room, or perhaps across the city entirely, the family itself sits down to its own table on a Sunday, the way every Florentine family does. There is a long cloth on the table, and too many dishes for the space, and a great deal of noise. The brothers of this particular family, sons of the man who first leased that small shop on Via della Vigna Nuova, cousins now scattered across Rome and Milan and New York and the workshops of home, argue with each other across that table the way brothers do everywhere, loudly, about business and about everything else, leaning back in their chairs to make a point and then leaning forward again to make the next one. A voice is raised over the price of a shipment, or the wisdom of a new shop, or which son is being given too much responsibility too soon. Then, just as loudly, they forgive each other by the time the last course is cleared away, because that too is simply how this family has always argued. Hard and briefly, and without much lasting grudge. It is nothing more in these years than the ordinary friction of a family grown large and successful together. Nobody sitting at that table yet imagines how far those particular arguments will eventually travel, or what they will one day cost the name above the shop doors. That is a story for later in the night, when the wine has been put away for good. Tonight the wine is still poured, and the voices settle, and the table is cleared, and everyone goes back to their own corner of the business, come morning, brothers again, at least until the next Sunday gives them something fresh to disagree about. Because in the end, whatever the name comes to mean in shop windows and magazines and airport lounges, it begins here every single day, in a room very much like this one. Not with a princess, and not with a photographer, and not with a showman's laugh in a New York hotel lobby. With a bench, with wax and thread, and an edge worked slowly smooth, with hands that know, without needing to think about it, exactly how much pressure a stitch will bear. Strip away the shop windows and the scarves, and the leather holdalls gliding through airport halls, and what is left, underneath all of it, is simply this. A luxury house, when you come close enough to see it plainly, is a room full of quiet hands. The light is going now, outside the tall windows of the workshop. One by one, along the bench, the tools are set down for the night. The awls laid straight, the needles wiped and coiled back onto their spool, the wax covered against the dust. The older craftsman nods to the younger one, and says nothing more than that, because after so many years together, nothing more needs to be said. The last lamp burns a little longer than the rest, and then it too is turned down low. Outside, the bell has already rung. The lane is quiet. Tomorrow, before the light properly returns, the shutters will be folded back again, and the bench will be waiting exactly as it was left. And the same patient hands, or hands very like them, will take up the same thread and begin again. Every house built on brothers eventually loses one. In 1974, Vasco Gucci died. He had never been the loudest voice at the table, the quiet third brother, the one who kept the Florence workshop running while the others chased New York and Rome. But he had always been a voice, and a house with 3 brothers around it is a different house from a house with 2. When Vasco went, the balance of the family went with him. For a season, the lawyers were busier than the tailors. Under the old Italian law, a wife inherits before a brother does, and so his widow held briefly a share of the business that neither Aldo nor Rodolfo had counted on sharing with anyone new. It was bought back in time quietly, the way families settle these things, when they would rather keep a matter inside the house than let it wander outside it. And what remained? Aldo and Rodolfo sat down and divided the business between them, half to one, half to the other. The way you might have a coat between 2 men standing in the cold, neither one asking whether it still fit the shoulders it was cut for. It fit Aldo very well. He was the builder, the salesman, the one who had carried the name across the ocean and dressed the windows on Fifth Avenue, who understood before almost anyone else in the family did, that a name could be sold the way a product is sold. For a while the half that was his felt, in every way that mattered, like the whole. But Aldo had 3 sons, and history has a habit of repeating its own shape, 1 generation down. Giorgio was the eldest, and horses interested him rather more than handbags ever did. He kept his distance from the boardroom battles that were coming, and outlasted nearly all of them for it. Roberto was the youngest, quiet, dependable, happy enough running a single shop in Brussels, while louder men did the arguing elsewhere. And in the middle stood Paolo, who wanted, more than anything else in the world, to design. Paolo had a gift, or believed he did, which in a family firm often amounts to nearly the same trouble. He filled notebook after notebook with ideas of his own, late into the night, sketches of shoes and belts and bags that the house was not always ready to use. Under a lamp that burned long after the workshop below had gone dark, and the leather smell had settled into the walls for the night. For a time his father indulged him. By the late 1970s, Paolo had risen, with Aldo's own blessing, to vice president of the whole company. And for a season it looked as though the frustrated designer had finally found his chair at the table, and might sit in it for good. It did not hold. The house he wanted to fill with his own name kept insisting, gently at first and then far less gently, that there was only one name that mattered here, and it was not his alone to use, however loudly his own blood ran in it. Paolo pushed, the house pushed back, and somewhere in that pushing, something in him decided he would rather raise a smaller house of his own, under his own name, than keep asking for more room under his father's roof. Meanwhile, the family name itself was learning to travel further than any Gucci had ever sent it, into rooms none of the brothers who founded this house would have recognized as their own. In 1979, the house launched what it called the Accessories Collection, and the doubled letter that had once marked a saddle or a trunk began appearing on almost anything that could be stitched, stamped, or molded. Key rings, cigarette lighters, small flasks meant for whiskey, sold in airport shops to travellers who might never once set foot in Florence, who knew the house only as 2 letters pressed into canvas behind a glass counter at the end of a long flight. The licenses went out to maker after maker, factory after factory, and the name travelled with them, further and further from the workshop that had made it mean something in the first place. It earned more money than the house had ever earned in a single year before. Rooms full of accountants who had never touched a hide of leather in their lives found, to their quiet astonishment, that the doubled letter alone, stamped onto cheap canvas and cheaper metal, could out-earn the finest handbag on the shelf. Soon enough, the same 2 letters could be found on stationery, on golf umbrellas, on playing cards sold beside the till in shops that had no connection at all to Florence or to leather, or to anything the founder of this house would have recognized as his own trade. And it thinned the name even as it swelled the accounts, the way a single sheet of gold hammered fine enough will gild an entire cathedral roof, beautifully and almost invisibly, and at the cost of ever being thick again. Paolo watched this happen and hated it, or said he did, which by now was nearly the family's native tongue. Every member of that generation, at one point or another, claimed to be the one who saw most clearly what the others were doing to the name. None of them, in the end, could stop it. By 1982, the argument between Paolo and his father had grown too large for private rooms, too large for lawyers' letters passed quietly back and forth. It came at last into a boardroom, in front of witnesses, where family arguments are never meant to go. We will tell this part gently because it deserves to be told gently, and because no good comes of dwelling on a family at its worst hour, however famous that hour later became. In the summer of that year, at a meeting of the board, Paolo brought a small recorder with him and spoke aloud grievances he had carried for years in front of the men he blamed for them. The room did not hold. Words gave way to shoving, and the shoving gave way to blows, and when it was over, Paolo left the building with his face marked and his shirt torn. And within days he had filed a $2 million lawsuit against the very company that carried his own name. His father, his brothers, and his cousin were all named in the filing that followed, and further filings followed that one, back and forth for years. It was the kind of afternoon a family doesn't recover from, not fully, not ever. Only learns to walk around, the way you learn to walk around a piece of furniture left too long in the wrong place, until moving it would hurt more than simply stepping past it every day for the rest of your life. Paolo did not stop there. He had gathered, over the years, whatever he could find of his father's private accounts. The paperwork of a man who had never expected his own son to go looking through it with different eyes than a son's. And afterward, quietly, he sent what he had to the authorities in America, where Aldo did much of his business and kept a great deal of what he had earned. We will not linger on the arithmetic of it. It is enough to say that for years, a great deal of what Aldo Gucci earned in America had never found its way onto the books the government could see, and that in the middle of the 1980s, the government finally saw it anyway, in papers a son had chosen to send them. In January of 1986, Aldo Gucci admitted, in an American courtroom, that he had evaded tax on millions of dollars of income. He was an old man by then, sentenced later that year, at the age of 81, to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison, still dressing every morning as though the cameras of Fifth Avenue might catch him at any moment, still carrying himself the way a man carries himself when he has spent 60 years being looked at. And that October, he walked through the gate of the federal prison camp at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida and put on the plain clothing they gave him, and became, for the better part of a year, a prisoner rather than a president. Picture him there a moment if you can bear to, and then let the picture go. The king of Fifth Avenue in a room the size of a wardrobe, with a cot and a window and a view of pine trees he had never before had reason to notice. No tailors here, no cameras, only the pine trees, and the slow Florida light moving across the wall through the hours of an ordinary day, the way it moved across the wall for every other man, in that camp, prince or otherwise. He had built more than any Gucci before him. The American stores, the New York fortune, the very idea that this small Florentine name might sit beside the grandest houses in the world. And in his 82nd year, he served time in a Florida prison camp because his own son had shown the authorities exactly where to look. He finished his sentence at a halfway house nearby and came home in time, an old man diminished but not destroyed, still recognizably himself. Still the man who had once believed there was no city in the world his name could not enter through the front door. But something in the house itself had been diminished with him, something that no return home could fully mend. A father does not easily forgive the hand that wrote the letter, even when that hand belongs to his own son, and a son does not easily forget what it cost him to write it. The The two men lived on for some years afterward in the same uneasy orbit families settle into once the worst has already happened between them. Polite in public and careful ever after in private. And while all of this unfolded in the glare of American courtrooms, a quieter, colder story was moving through the other half of the family, far from any camera at all. Rodolfo Gucci died in 1983 in Milan, leaving Aldo as the last surviving one of the three brothers who had once stood behind the counter of a small leather shop and imagined it might grow into something larger than themselves. He had never sought the spotlight his brother Aldo lived for, had spent his own years happier on a film set than a sales floor, in the years before the leather business claimed the whole of his attention, and he left this world quietly, in the way he had largely tried to move through it. He left his half of the house to his only son, Maurizio, a careful, watchful man who had spent his childhood at the edges of his father's world, rather than its centre, more comfortable, by every account, in a quiet room with a book than in a boardroom with a raised voice. Now, in his middle 30s, he found the whole of it placed suddenly into his hands, at an age when most men are still learning the shape of their own working lives, let alone the shape of someone else's empire. It should have been a simple inheritance. It was not. Aldo's side of the family came to believe that the papers transferring Rodolfo's shares to Maurizio had been arranged before they properly ought to have been signed, they said, in a hand that did not entirely match his father's, dated in a way that would have spared the estate a very large tax bill, at a time when father and son could no longer easily be asked which of them had truly held the pen. Investigators in Italy agreed there was a case worth answering, and for a time it looked as though Maurizio might follow his uncle into a courtroom, and perhaps further than that. The story goes that he did not wait to find out. Alone in the night, he rode north on a motorcycle, away from Milan and toward the mountains, the city lights falling behind him one street at a time, until the road began to climb and the air turned thin and cold, and somewhere in that dark, he crossed into Switzerland, where a chalet above St. Moritz stood waiting for him, high above the snowline, its windows dark, its fires unlit, until he arrived to light them himself. He stayed there through the worst of it, beyond the reach of the courts that wanted him, while lawyers argued his case at a careful distance, back in the warmer, lower air of Milan. It took years to settle. A court convicted him first of attempted tax fraud and gave him a 1-year suspended sentence. But in December of 1989, an appeals court overturned that conviction and acquitted him. Whatever had happened to that signature, no crime in it was left, in the end, standing against Maurizio's name. By then, the war inside the family had already found its true ending, and it was fought neither with fists nor in courtrooms. It was fought with money, patiently, over years, and it was won, in the end, by an outsider standing entirely outside the family's long argument. Maurizio, needing capital and wary of his own cousins, looked for a partner outside the family entirely, and found one in a Bahrain-based investment house named InvestCorp. Slowly, patiently, InvestCorp began buying up whatever remained of Aldo's branch of the family's holding, share by share, meeting by meeting, until, by 1989, it owned the whole of what had once been Aldo's half of the house. The uncle who had built the American fortune, the sons who had fought over the studio and the boardroom and the ledgers, all of them, one by one, sold out or were bought out, and stepped back at last from the table they had spent 15 years fighting over, leaving nothing behind them but the shape of the argument itself. For the first time, one Gucci held uncontested control of the house. InvestCorp, patient and unmoved by any of it, still owned the other half. And for the first time in all those years, there was no one else left at the table to argue with him about it. The chairs stood empty around him, pushed in, waiting for men who were not coming back, in a room that had heard more raised voices over the previous decade than in the whole half-century that came before it. There is an old idea that a man's true wants show themselves best in what he chooses to save, rather than in what he chooses to build. In 1983, the same year his father died and the whole of Rodolfo's half of the house settled onto his shoulders, Maurizio Gucci found a boat that had been left for lost. She had been beautiful once, more than 50 years before. The largest wooden sailing yacht ever built, they said, made for a wealthy American who had her masts shortened because he thought them too tall against the sky. She passed from owner to owner across the decades that followed, through a British yachtsman's hands and a Greek shipping fortune's hands, requisitioned once for the plainer work of wartime, restored once more after, and by the time Maurizio came across her, she was serving out her years as a training vessel for young Danish sailors, her black hull tired, her decks worn thin by hands that had no notion what she had once been or what she might be again. He bought her and spent years bringing her back, plank by plank, rope by rope, craftsman by patient craftsman, working in a yard that smelled of tar and fresh-cut timber, long into the evenings, the old naval joints traced and copied by hand, from drawings nearly as old as the boat herself. Until the Creole sailed again, as she had sailed in her finest years, black-hulled and vast under full canvas, the way a man might pour a fortune into restoring a house nobody else could see the point of saving, simply because he alone could still see what it had once been, and might be again. Men who worked in that yard through those years said afterward that he came often, and stood for long stretches saying nothing at all, simply watching the timber take its old shape back beneath other men's hands. It was never really about the boat. Maurizio kept another retreat above the tree line, in St. Moritz, in the same high, hushed air his father had once known, a chalet with a wide window looking out over a valley of snow that no one had yet walked across that day. And whether you sat with him on the deck of that restored yacht, or at that quiet mountain window, one lamp lit against the blue dusk, you would have heard, underneath everything he said, the same wish, offered in different words each time. He wanted the house that carried his name to become small again, fine again. A single beautiful thing, cared for by people who understood it, rather than 1,000 ordinary ones wearing the same 2 letters on 1,000 different shelves. It was, in almost every way, the opposite of what his uncle had built, and he knew it, and he did not mind that it was. So Maurizio began cutting back. He ended the licenses that had scattered the doubled letter across lighters and flasks and keyrings, one agreement at a time over the objections of men who had grown comfortable on the money those licenses brought in. He pulled the name out of countless duty-free counters, out of shops that had never once smelled of leather or seen a hand-stitched seam, that had known the house only as a shape stamped on cheap canvas beside the boarding gate, and he went looking in New York for someone who understood taste rather than volume, and found her running the shop floors at Bergdorf Goodman, a quiet, exacting woman named Dawn Mello, whom he brought to Florence to remake the house from within, one collection at a time, one shop at a time. Under her hand, the racks grew thinner, the lines narrowed. Whole categories of cheaper goods were quietly allowed to disappear from the shelves, never restocked, never missed by the sort of customer the house now wanted back. What Gucci sold, it sold with far more care and far less of it. And slowly, in certain rooms at least, the name that had been stretched across 1,000 market stalls began to mean something fine again. The way an old tired fabric can be rewoven thread by thread into something that once again holds its shape. But taste asks for patience, and money rarely grants it, and the house was losing a great deal of the second while it waited for the first to arrive. Investcorp had bought into the business as a partner, not as a patron, and partners who watch losses gather year after year eventually stop asking when the turn will come and start asking whether it will come at all. Auditors were called in, quiet men with quiet briefcases who sat in rooms Maurizio had once walked through alone. Figures were laid on tables that did nothing to encourage anyone's patience. And through the early 1990s, the distance between Maurizio and the investors, who now owned half his father's house, grew wider with every set of figures placed before them, meeting after meeting, season after season. In September of 1993, that distance gave way for good. Maurizio signed away the last of his shares and stepped down and walked out of the building his family had occupied for 3 generations, past the same reception desk, down the same stone stairs, into a street that no longer, in any legal sense, belonged to his name at all. It is worth sitting with what that moment meant, because the story rarely offers a cleaner ending than this one. A small leather shop had opened its doors in Florence in 1921. For 72 years, in good seasons and terrible ones, through licenses and lawsuits, through a father's prison sentence, and a son's flight across a mountain border, there had always been a Gucci at Gucci. Now, for the first time since that door first opened, there was not. He walked away wealthy and without a house, and a name that now belonged, in every way the law recognized, to somebody else entirely. He was 45 years old, and by every outward measure, his life was only just clearing itself for what should have been its second chapter. To understand what came for him instead, we must go back a little, to a marriage that had ended long before the shares ever did. Maurizio had married Patrizia Reggiani in 1972, against his own father's wishes. Rodolfo thought her a fortune hunter, and said so plainly, though he gave the young couple an apartment in New York all the same, the way fathers so often soften a judgment they cannot quite enforce. She had come from a family with far less than the Guccis had, and had climbed by every account, with real ambition and real charm, into a world that had not been built to let her in easily, learning its manners and its languages as she went, until few who met her in later years could have guessed at the distance she had travelled to arrive there. Those who knew the couple in the early years described them as genuinely fond of one another, even happy in the ordinary way of young marriages, before the weight of a family business settles fully upon them. 2 daughters followed, born some years apart, and for a decade the marriage held roughly the shape a marriage is meant to hold, in the apartments and the parties and the long summers that money like that can buy. Then, in the spring of 1985, it stopped holding. Maurizio told his wife he was leaving on a short trip. He did not come home. A friend was sent instead of the man himself to tell her the marriage was over. And whatever else may be said of the years that followed, this is the detail that never stopped being spoken of within the family. That Patrizia Reggiani learned her marriage had ended from someone else's mouth, in her own home, with no warning given to her face at all. She did not take it quietly. She had never, by every account, been a quiet woman. And in the years that followed, while Maurizio built a new life in a Milan apartment, with another woman, Paola Franchi, Patrizia's anger did not fade the way these things are meant to fade with time. If anything, it found more and more to feed upon, each year adding a fresh grievance to the ones already sitting there, unresolved. In 1992, she learned of a growth in her brain and underwent surgery for it, and the operation, by every account, went well. The growth proved less serious than had been feared, and she recovered physically in full. But something in her had already set past the point any surgery could reach, and those who knew her in those years described a woman fixed upon a single grievance, turned over so many times it had worn a channel through her, the way water wears a groove into stone given enough years and no other direction to flow. She wanted, beyond whatever the divorce settlement granted her, some accounting for what she felt had been taken from her. And when no court and no negotiation offered her one, she began quietly, in a manner almost no one around her fully understood at the time, to look for it elsewhere. We return now, gently, to the morning this story opened with. It was the 27th of March in 1995. Milan was cold in the particular way early spring mornings are cold in that city, a dampness that settles into stone rather than air, into the wool of a coat, into the backs of hands. At about 8:30, Maurizio Gucci arrived, as he did most mornings, at Via Palestro 20, the building that housed the private office he still kept, a short stretch of pavement he must have crossed 1,000 times without once giving it a thought. The way you stop noticing the last few steps of any walk you have made every working day of your life. The doorman, Giuseppe Onorato, was sweeping the entrance steps the way he did most mornings, and Maurizio greeted him, exchanging the same small nod he exchanged every morning. A man had followed him in from the street, standing where a man had no obvious reason to stand at that hour, in that kind of cold. We will not dwell here on who he was, or how he came to be there, because that belongs to what follows, not to this moment, and this moment deserves to be held exactly as it was, without anything borrowed forward from later. Then the man raised a gun and fired 4 times. We will not describe more of it than that. It is enough to say that there was nothing left to be done, and that the street for a moment held the particular silence a street holds after a sound it was not built to carry. The gunman turned then on Giuseppe Onorato and shot him too before walking away. Onorato was gravely wounded. He survived. Then, as streets do, the morning moved again. Cars passed at the corner. A shutter went up somewhere down the block. The ordinary business of a Monday morning settled back over the spot almost as soon as it had broken open, the way water settles back over a stone dropped into it, leaving no seam at all, as though nothing had passed through it. He was 46 years old. He died before any help could reach him, on the steps of the very building that had, only 18 months before, still counted him among its owners. A doorway he had climbed towards 1,000 mornings, without once considering it, and would never climb towards again. Let the street stay quiet a while. There is nothing more to add to it tonight. For nearly 2 years, the case went nowhere. Milan is not a small city, and a killing on a stairway, however well-dressed the man who fell there, can vanish into its files the way a stone vanishes into a lake. A ring on the surface, and then nothing, and then, after a while, not even the ring. Then, in January of 1997, a telephone rang in a police office, and a voice that offered no name said only that it had one word to give, and the word was the family name itself. It was thread enough for investigators to begin, patiently pulling on it through a hotel night porter who had once been asked a quiet question by the wrong person, and a go-between who had passed that question further along, and finally to the hand that had arranged, though not fired, the gun upon that stairway. At the end of that January, the arrests came, one after another, in the grey early hours investigators seemed to prefer for such things. Patrizia Reggiani was among them. The court did not move quickly, because a case such as this one never should. But in the autumn of 1998, the court delivered its finding. It held that Patrizia Reggiani had arranged the killing of her former husband. Prosecutors described a mixture of motives, resentment, jealousy, and a fear of losing money and status, rather than any single grievance, and the court sentenced her to 29 years in prison. Her lawyers argued, at various points, that the surgery on her brain some years before had changed her, had left her unable to answer fully for what she had done. The court in the end was not persuaded. In the year 2000, an appeals court upheld the conviction, but reduced the sentence to 26 years. We will leave the courtroom there, and go looking instead for somewhere quieter to end this long chapter of the story. Go back once more to the Creole, if you can hold her shape in your mind. The great restored hull he rescued from a training school in Denmark, gliding now under sail on some evening sea. Her lines exactly as they were 60 years before he ever found her, and long, long before any of this. He is not aboard her any longer. He never will be again. But the boat he loved enough to spend a fortune making beautiful outlived him, the way the things we love most quietly outlive us all. And somewhere tonight, on some sea or in some quiet harbour, she is still riding at anchor, black hull and tall masts, holding her shape against the dark, patient, unhurried, exactly as he left her. long after the house that once gave her his family's name had already let it go. There is no boardroom in this picture, and no courtroom either. There is only the hull and the sea, and the particular unhurried patience of a thing built to outlast the people who love it. Let her drift there a while longer on that dark water, and let the evening gather slowly, softly around her. By the late 1990s, there was no one left at the top of this house who shared its founder's blood. You have already sat with that, but a name is not the same thing as a company, and while the family had been ripping itself apart, in courtrooms and in newspapers, for the better part of 2 decades, another and quieter story had been running alongside it, almost without the family noticing. This chapter is that story, and then, at the end of it, a walk. It begins with a young man from Texas, who had trained as an architect before he ever touched fabric, and who arrived in Florence and then Milan in 1990, hired as a ready-to-wear designer by a woman named Dawn Mello. Mello had come from Bergdorf Goodman in New York, brought in to steady a house that was, by then, closer to folding than anyone in the industry cared to say aloud. Its stores tired, its leather goods copied more often than they were bought, its name a punchline in certain circles rather than a promise. She saw something in the young Texan almost at once. Within months he was designing menswear as well as women's. Before long, shoes too. He was, people said, hungry for the whole of it, not just his corner. When Mello left, in the spring of 1994, to go back to Bergdorf's as its president, she is said to have put his name forward herself. And so, at the age of not yet 33, Tom Ford became the creative head of a house that had by then very nearly stopped being one. Almost everyone who remembered the old workshops had gone. He inherited empty rooms, half-finished ideas, and a name that the fashion pages had begun quietly to write off. His first outing that autumn was mild. Pretty even, all soft prints and circle skirts, nothing that suggested what was coming. Nobody much noticed it. The house waited. Then came the 1st of March, 1995. In a hall in Milan, under lights, the house that had been written off came back to life in under half an hour. Low, hip-hugging velvet trousers, satin shirts, unbuttoned further than the decade had been used to. Kate Moss walked that show, and Amber Valletta and Shalom Harlow, and by the time the last of them had gone the length of the room, the fashion writers in the seats were already reaching for words like reborn. A few months later, a pop singer would wear one of those satin shirts to an awards evening in New York, and a whole generation who had never once bought a leather handbag would learn for the first time that the name Gucci meant something again. It is worth sitting with the date of that show a moment, quietly, because of what happened just under 4 weeks later. On the 27th of March, on the steps of an office not far from that same city, Maurizio Gucci was shot dead by a man his former wife had hired. You already know that story. You carried it earlier tonight. And here is the strange, sad shape of it. In the very same handful of weeks, on streets not far apart, one Gucci story was ending in blood on a staircase. And another Gucci story, with barely any Gucci left inside it, was just beginning, in velvet, under lights, a few streets over. The two of them passed each other that March, and neither noticed the other going by. Alongside the young designer stood another figure, older, quieter, never once stepping into the lights himself. Domenico De Sole. He had trained as a tax lawyer, not a fashion man at all, and had first come to know the house in the early 1980s, advising the family through the opening years of its long unraveling. In 1984, he joined the company outright, running its American arm from an office in New York, and rose within a couple of years to the presidency of that same American business. In 1994, he moved to Florence itself as the group's chief operating officer, and within the year, as the family's last shareholdings were finally bought out and the old arguments went quiet, He was made chief executive of the whole house. He did the arithmetic while the designer did the dreaming. It was, people who worked there like to say, an unlikely and near-perfect partnership. One man building the image, the other building the machine underneath it. So that for once in this house's long history, nobody with the surname Gucci was required at all. Under Dolce, the house did something it had never done in its whole life. In the autumn of 1995, it went onto the public markets. Shares of it sold to strangers in New York and beyond. The ownership of a family firm scattered for the first time across thousands of hands that had never set foot in Florence. It was, in its way, the final and most complete goodbye to the old model. No more squabbling heirs with sole claim to the name, only shareholders now, and a board, and quarterly numbers. That new public shape made the house strong, and it also made it, for a while, something that could be bought, which is more or less what nearly happened next. In the January of 1999, Dolce received word that a large French luxury group had quietly begun buying up shares in the house. The story goes it started at around 5 in the 100, and within weeks had climbed past a third of the whole company. It was the kind of creeping approach that unsettles a boardroom rather more than an open bid ever could. Dolce and Ford fought it in every way available to them, through the courts of more than one country, arguing that a rival's slow accumulation of shares was not the same thing as a fair offer to every shareholder. Among their defences, the house set up a scheme that handed a large new block of shares to its own employees, diluting the French group's stake almost overnight. A maneuver lawyers in both countries argued over for years afterwards. Then, that March, a different French group arrived, headed by a financier named François Pinault, better known until then for department stores and auction houses than for fashion, and agreed to put in something in the order of $3 billion for a large minority stake, new shares issued directly to him, diluting the first group's position and keeping the house independent of its rival, if no longer independent of everyone. The legal wrangling over the fairness of it ran on for a year or more in the Netherlands, where the parent company was registered, and eventually the two French sides settled between themselves rather than let the courts decide it. The Dutch court separately had already cancelled the employee share scheme outright, though it let Gucci's alliance with Pinault stand. The house had its rescuer. It was no longer entirely its own. Ford and Dolce carried on, for a few years yet, building the group that resulted, folding in other old names, Yves Saint Laurent among them, and a shoemaker called Bottega Veneta, and an eyewear maker, and more besides, into something larger than the Gucci name alone had ever been. By some counts it had grown, under the two of them, into the third largest luxury group in the world. But the terms of their long working arrangement with the new French owners were due for renewal, and the two sides could not agree on what came next. How much freedom the designer and his chief officer would keep, and to whom exactly they would answer. In the autumn of 2003, it was announced that both men would go, and by the spring of 2004, they had. A decade of work on both sides folded quietly into a handshake and a departure date. Ford would not design for the house again. The atelier doors shut behind Ford for the last time that spring, and the years just after were quieter under other hands. The house feeling its way toward whatever came next without the two men who had rebuilt it. Then, in the January of 2015, a designer who had worked inside the house for over a decade without much public notice, Alessandro Michele, was asked almost at the last moment to reshape a menswear show that was only days away. What he showed startled everyone watching, romantic and strange, and nothing like the sharp sexual house Ford had built 20 years before, and within weeks he had been given the whole of it to remake in his own image. He would run the design of the house for the better part of a decade. Today the house belongs, along with a great many other old names, to a French group that calls itself Kering. The same Pinault family, grown larger still, its holdings spread now across half the luxury houses of Europe. Behind that ownership, this house keeps its own workshops, its own history, its own quiet corner of Florence that no boardroom in Paris can quite reach. And it is to that corner you will walk now. Leave the courts and the shareholders and the French financiers behind you, and walk instead into Florence at night, the way the story always seems to want to end. You are on Via della Vigna Nuova. It is a narrow street, the kind that keeps its own weather, cooler than the piazzas, quieter than the river. Somewhere along here, at the address they still point to, a young man who had once carried other people's luggage for a living opened a small shop of his own in the year 1921, selling saddles and travelling cases to people who could afford both. He had learned more of his trade during a spell with a Milanese leather goods firm named Franzi, before deciding he would rather answer to no one. The shop is not that shop any longer. Almost nothing on this street is what it was. But the window is still lit at this hour, the way shop windows in old streets always seem to be, whether or not anyone is coming. Walk on, past the darkened windows of a dozen other old names, toward the water. The Arno at this hour is a black ribbon under the bridges, and the air over it smells faintly of stone and river damp, the way old riverside cities always seem to, whatever the century, cross, and on the far bank, in workshops you cannot see from the street. The story goes that certain bags are still made almost exactly as they were made 70 or 80 years ago. By hand, one artisan to one piece, waxed thread pulled slowly through leather, a length of bamboo held over a low flame and bent patiently until it holds its own curve without complaint. Machines do the easy parts elsewhere in the world now. These rooms keep the hard parts quietly, the way old houses keep their oldest habits, because someone, generations ago, decided that this was the one thing that must never be handed over to anyone else. Cross back into the Piazza della Signoria, where the statues stand pale in the dark and the old tower keeps its watch over the square the way it has for centuries. In one corner of the piazza stands the Palazzo della Mercanzia, where the house opened what it called Gucci Garden. In 2018, a space now known, under a newer name, as Palazzo Gucci, because names on buildings change more often than the buildings themselves. Inside, behind shuttered doors at this hour, the archive waits in the dark. Bamboo handles under glass, worn smooth by decades of hands. A scarf of flowers, folded flat in acid-free tissue, that a Florentine illustrator painted in the 1960s for a princess who had once been a film star. The house wanted a gift worthy of her, so the story goes, and gave her a garden she could fold into a handbag and carry anywhere in the world. A century of luggage, standing in ranks the way the barrels and the casks stood in other houses, in other cities, earlier tonight. Nothing in there is moving. Everything in there is waiting for morning, and for footsteps, and for someone to look at it and feel for a moment that none of it is really gone. Stand in front of the glass a while, if you can, in your mind's eye. A bamboo handle worn pale by 70 years of hands. A scarf of flowers that a woman somewhere wore to a wedding, decades ago, and kept afterwards in a drawer lined with paper. A trunk with brass corners, the kind built to survive an ocean crossing, empty now and polished, and utterly still. None of these things argued in courtrooms, or issued shares, or fought over percentages. They only sat patiently, being made well, while all of that noise happened somewhere else, far above them. And far away from all of it, over the mountains, over the sea, in a city this whole story keeps circling back to without ever quite explaining why. A hotel called the Savoy still stands on a street called the Strand, its doors still turning, its lamps still lit along the covered drive, and somewhere just inside them, even at this hour, a porter is carrying someone's cases through the light and into the warmth beyond. The hotel has been standing there since long before any of this began, hosting kings and singers and travellers nobody remembers now, indifferent in its grand and steady way to whichever century happens to be passing through its doors, The porter doesn't know that a boy once stood exactly where he is standing, watching those same kinds of cases pass, and decided that he too would learn to make things worth carrying. He never could have known it. That is rather the point of a beginning. You almost never do. We end, as before, by the fire. It has burned low while you were away in Florence, and in Milan, and in London. The room has gone the colour of embers now. The shelves no more than shapes in the dark. The desk a paler patch beneath the window. Somewhere behind you, if you turned to look, you would find the hearth almost spent. But you are not going to turn. You are going to let it burn the rest of the way down on its own. Not the steps in Milan this time. Leave those where they belong, in the cold, in the past, in the part of the story that has already finished happening. Instead, if you picture anything at all as you drift, let it be the other image. The one from the very beginning of tonight. A boy of not yet 20, far from home, standing in a bright London doorway with somebody else's trunk in his arms, watching the wealthy come and go, memorizing, without quite knowing why, the weight and the stitching and the shine of what they carried. He could not have known what would come of that watching. He only knew that he liked the weight of good leather in his hands, and that he intended one day to make some of his own. That is where the circle finishes tonight. Not with a family, because the family, in the end, is almost entirely gone from this story, scattered, or gone to their rest, or living quietly under other names, a very long way from any boardroom. What remains is only the thing the boy at the Savoy first noticed. The leather, the stitching, the bamboo bent just so. The name outlived the family that made it. That is the whole plain shape of this house, when you take everything else away. Somewhere in Tuscany tomorrow morning, while you are still asleep, a craftsman will hold a length of cane over a small flame, and bend it slowly, patiently, the way it has been bent for the better part of 80 years, until it holds its curve without being told to twice. He will not think of Texas, or of Paris, or of a staircase in Milan. He will not think of shareholders, or French financiers, or a boy who once carried luggage in a London hotel. He will think only of the cane, and the flame, and getting the curve exactly right. That is how a house like this actually goes on. Not in courtrooms, not in headlines, but in small rooms, in ordinary mornings. In hands that have done the same small thing 10,000 times before, long after everyone who argued over the house has been forgotten, and the house itself remains. The candle beside you leans and rights itself and leans again. You do not need to hold on to any of it now. Not the family, not the fight, not the fire itself. It will still be here tomorrow evening, waiting the way it always is. The flame settles, the dark is warm. We will meet again by this fire for another story. Sleep well.